Welcome to Aging Revolution, the Java podcast. My name is Ty, and I am your host. Our guest today is Helena Berger from REV UP Virginia. Helena, what can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Ty, for inviting me. I'm excited to have this conversation, especially since we know we have such a critical election coming up in Virginia this year. So again, thanks. In terms of me, I've been a disability rights advocate for, I hate to admit, but it's over 30 years. It may be getting close to 35 years. I recently retired from an organization called the American Association of People with Disabilities. I was their president and CEO, and it was actually where REV UP got its start. AAPD, American Association of People with Disabilities, is the national coordinator of REV UP. And I could segue now into REV UP Virginia. You can almost think of REV UP Virginia as sort of not necessarily a chapter, but like an affiliate. And REV UP, for people who aren't aware of it, stands for Register, Educate, Vote, Use Your Power. And myself and my co-chair, Susan Leidick, we started REV UP in April of 2021. So we're only about 4 years old. And our premise is all about building the political power of disabled Virginians. And we look at REV UP Virginia as a voter education initiative, a way to really educate voters about their rights, where they can get information. And we do this in many different ways in terms of webinars. And we have Disability Voting Rights Week every year, where we get folks registered, we educate the community. And I think it's important to say that REV UP Virginia, although it is obviously disability focused, and we are this statewide disability vote coalition, it is really important that we have allies as part of our coalition. So we've really made an effort to reach out to folks who are not necessarily members of the disability community, but certainly are stakeholders and can help us continue to educate both people with disabilities and, just as importantly, the general public. And it's all about advancing, the disability vote and growing that political power.
You guys do an amazing job with that. I've been looking at your websites and your social media in the last little bit, and this is a very critical time. And in November, there'll be another election cycle starting. So it is a big time for getting out there and being an advocate for the things that you are passionate about and the things that you truly believe in right now.
Yeah, and I should say REV UP Virginia is nonpartisan. So again, it is about voter education. We don't tell people how to vote. We give them the information so they can make good, informed decisions. But I think we are both in Virginia and on a national level. I think we have the responsibility to be informed and to make, the best decisions who we think will best represent our interests.
So I guess my first question for you today is, how did you become involved in this work? I know you said that you've been working with disability advocacy for almost 35 years now. So that's a very long history to have with one group that you're very passionate about, it seems.
I graduated college with a political science background, so I had an interest in advocacy work. And when I moved to the Philadelphia, Southern New Jersey area, I began looking for employment. Prior to that, when I got out of school, I was actually in the stock brokerage business working on Wall Street. Not something that I chose to do, but as when you get out of school, that doesn't mean your first job is necessarily the career path you want to take. So as I mentioned, I was interested in political science, advocacy work, government relations work. Fast forward, I'm looking for a job. And this goes back a long time ago. So this is when you actually looked in the newspaper, in the want ads for jobs versus online. That's showing my age. And in the Philadelphia Inquirer, it had a job listed for an advocacy position and a government relations position with an organization called Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association. They are now called United Spinal Association, but basically it was a disability organization representing the interests of disabled vets and folks who weren't veterans, but were also folks who had spinal cord injuries. And I got the job. And to be perfectly honest, I was not a person, I'm not a person with a disability. I didn't know a lot about the community. I didn't know a lot about the issues. I thought I was sort of enlightened when it came to civil rights. And I got this advocacy position, and it opened up a whole new world in terms of how people with disabilities are being discriminated. And that's basically how I started my career. I was an advocate in the Philadelphia, southern New Jersey, southeastern region of Pennsylvania. I eventually got promoted to being their advocacy director. When I moved to the Washington area, I began working for APD, and then eventually became the president and CEO. And yeah, I never left the disability rights work. I'm just, because of the passion that I feel around it.
So how did you and your co-founder, Susan, kind of decide to start Rev Up Virginia, and how did that process look for you guys?
So because I was intimately involved in Rev Up through AAPD, and basically started Rev Up when I was at AAPD, I do want to give a shout out. Before Rev Up went national, there was Rev Up Texas. So the genesis of Rev Up actually started in Rev Up Texas. And then I had a conversation with the folks in Texas, and they said, you know what, we're going to hand this over to AAPD so you can take it national. So fast forward, when I retired from AAPD back in 2019, Susan and I were talking, and we're like, there isn't a Rev Up Virginia. We should start a Rev Up Virginia. And that's what we did. In April of 2021, we launched Rev Up Virginia because we felt really strongly that, we need to have a statewide disability vote coalition, and really start, building the power, and also showing that there is a disability vote, which a lot of people aren't aware of. And I could probably talk more about that later, but that's the genesis of how we got started in Virginia.
Many non-disabled individuals may not understand the barriers individuals with disabilities face during voting, during the election cycle. Can you talk to some of those barriers and how Rev Up aims to help?
So one big barrier is transportation. Just being able to get yourself either to the polls, or if you're doing an absentee ballot and you want to go to the drop box, that's a big problem. And it's especially a problem if you need accessible transportation. And it's even a bigger problem if you live in rural areas where accessible transportation and transportation in general is just not as available. Another issue is poorly trained poll workers, which obviously has an effect if you're voting, in person. Not necessarily knowing exactly what the rights of a disabled voter is, not necessarily knowing how to use the accessible voting machine. So that's an issue. Inaccessible polling places, not having necessarily an accessible voting machine, or if you have a voting machine, it may malfunction, or as I mentioned, you may have a machine and it's working, but you don't have a poll worker who knows how to use it. So I would say those are some of the real major barriers and obstacles. I'm sometimes a little wonky and like to get into stats, and I think this stat is pretty telling, and it's a national stat, and it goes back to the 2022 midterm election. We don't have anything more recent yet, but 14%, or basically 2.2 million disabled voters, reported problems with voting, and that was 3 times higher than the rate of people without disabilities. So that's pretty telling. The other thing I'd also like to just quickly mention, I'm going to look at my notes for this, is the Disability Law Center of Virginia. They do a survey around every election. So they did their 2024 survey. I think they surveyed close to 500 polling places. And their report came out, and I'm looking at what are some of their key findings. So this is very specific to Virginia, so I thought your listeners would be interested. So one key finding had to do with curbside voting, and they're saying that 10% of survey sites lacked clear signage for curbside voting. Another one was accessible parking, that 18% of locations failed to provide accessible parking closest to the entrance. Another one was entrance and pathway issues, where 12% of locations did not offer an accessible entrance at the primary voting entrance. And that additionally, 15% lacked a smooth and clear path of travel to the entrance or to the door. Once again, not surprising, interior and accessibility issues, both, like I say, physical and as well as voting machines. And then just in general, not complying with current accessibility standards. So even though the good news is that a vast majority of polling places in Virginia are accessible, we still have these barriers. You know, here we are in 2025, it's going to be, you know, the 35th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And, you know, people with disabilities, you know, are still dealing with problems that should have been resolved, you know, years ago. I think you asked how can Rev Up Virginia, or what are we doing in terms of trying to dismantle some of these barriers? Again, I think a lot of it has to do with education. We provide information so disabled voters know what their rights are, you know, to be an informed voter, where they can get the information. And this obviously goes beyond just disabled voters. We also feel like, you know, part of our role is just educating voters in general, but of course we're focused on people with disabilities. We do this through our social media. We have webinars. We have a Gmail listserv where we'll send out information. I would like to mention, just a plug, that coming this fall, we are doing a candidates forum with 3 other disability organizations, the ARC of Virginia, the ARC of Northern Virginia, and the Northern Virginia Autism Society. And it's going to be with all the candidates in terms of running in the executive branch. So it will be governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. And again, that's going to be a great way to inform voters about where these candidates stand on disability issues. I also think it's important that we work with allies. And one of our biggest allies is the League of Women Voters of Virginia. Probably one of our, like I said, biggest allies, best supporters. You know, come to our Disability Voting Rights Week events and, you know, get folks registered. They'll push out our information. So I really think that that's important to be working with allies. We've developed a good collaborative working relationship with the Virginia Department of Elections. We've had Commissioner Susan Beals come speak with our coalition. It's a way to find out what they're doing. It's a way for her to hear from us what our concerns and issues are. And then I think just lastly is, over the last year or two, we've gotten more involved in policy and legislative work and working with the General Assembly. So in 23 and 24, we worked hard to improve the current curbside voting law. Before it got passed in 2024, it was if you were eligible if you were 65 or older or had a physical disability. Now it's 65 and older and any disability. And the other thing I'll mention, this year, I would say Rev Up Virginia was primarily responsible for getting a bill introduced. Unfortunately, the governor vetoed it, but it was to better protect the voting rights of individuals with disabilities that are under guardianship. Because right now, if you are under guardianship, you lose your right to vote. And the only way you get it back is you have to go to court, which becomes a battle. It could be expensive. And like I said, it almost passed unanimously, but unfortunately got vetoed. And I know you represent, obviously, a lot of older Americans, and many older Americans are under guardianship, as well as people with disabilities, especially people with intellectual disabilities. So we're going to keep fighting that issue. But again, just some examples of what we're doing to hopefully, again, dismantle barriers and improve the voting rights of people with disabilities.
So you talked a little bit about those voters' rights for people with disabilities. Can you kind of explain for people who maybe don't know what those are, how they're different? Could you talk a little bit about that?
So for example, your polling place should meet the ADA accessibility guidelines and whatever standards there are in Virginia. That is basically a right. You should have, right? It should be accessible and usable. The Help America Vote Act, when it was passed, it said that every polling place in a federal election should have an accessible voting machine. Now, because those voting machines were purchased, you're going to see them outside of federal elections. So basically, there should be a polling place, a voting machine in every polling place. So that's something you should expect, and it should be working. And again, the poll worker, if you don't know how to use it, should be able to tell you how to use it. If you need to bring in an assistant with you to vote, that's permissible. The only thing it says that assistant cannot be your employer or a union representative. So, and you could also, and if you don't have anybody to be your assistant and you need an assistant, again, it could be a poll worker. So these are some, I think, the really important things to be aware of in terms of what your rights are as a disabled person who wants to vote. Yeah, I think those would be some of the major highlights to be aware of.
Some people who do not interact with individuals with disabilities, who maybe don't understand anything about disabilities, they may not understand why it's so important that adults with disabilities have a voice in an election. Could you kind of say why that is?
Sure. No, I love that question. And I think it goes at the heart of what Rev Up Virginia and Rev Up National is all about. As I stated earlier in the description of Rev Up, it's building political power. So it's building it, but we also want to demonstrate the political power that people with disabilities or disabled Virginians already have. We want those who are running for office, in office, to know there is a disability vote and they need to take our concerns seriously. And in order to do that, they need to know we vote. Let's be honest, politicians usually care about two things. Do you vote for me and do you give me money? Well, a lot of people with disabilities can't afford to give candidates money. The statistic says, people with disabilities, the poverty rate is twice as high as non-disabled people, but we can certainly vote, and we have the numbers to vote. Again, a national number, in 2024, a study done by Rutgers University projected about 70 million Americans with disabilities were eligible to vote. In Virginia, this goes back, I think, to 2020. I think we calculated about 15% of the electorate for people with disabilities. And when we know how close elections have been, both on the state and federal level, every vote does make a difference. You can make that difference. I'm going to just throw out another stat because I think this one is really, really, really important. In the 2022 midterm election, people with disabilities or disabled Virginians and those without disabilities in Virginia voted at the same rate. I really want to underscore that. People are always so surprised because they always think people with disabilities aren't voting. Yes, there's still a gap nationally, and that has shrunk between voters with and without disability. But again, in 2022, there was no gap. We voted at the same rate. It was 53.2%. That's a strong, strong message to get out there. Another reason is by voting, you're helping to shape and influence policy, right? Our elections determine who leads us and how they're going to deal with our issues and other issues. So we want to have a say in the people who get elected. And again, it's a way to protect our interests. I would also say that, and maybe this is also one of the most important things, especially in our current environment, that voting empowers people with disabilities to actively participate in the democratic process. And again, I think now more than ever, we all have an obligation, as Americans, American citizens to fulfill that obligation. And we all need to be active participants in our democracy. And with such a crucial election happening in November in Virginia, we need to be part of and have a say in the future of Virginia. So I think those are just, some of the really important reasons, in my opinion, why people with disabilities need to vote.
We've discussed this a little bit already, about what accessible voting options there are currently for individuals with disabilities. We have absentee ballots, there's ADA compliance, voting polls and stations. But are there any other things you think could make voting more accessible that maybe isn't happening now that you would like to see happen, or things that are starting to happen but aren't necessarily widespread yet?
Right. So just to make it clear, if people don't already know, so some of the voting options that really help people with disabilities. So there's the in-person early voting. And that happens 40 days prior to an election. So I must admit, in Virginia, we have, a lot of time to get our act together and make a plan to vote. And, the in-person could help people with disabilities, especially if you have an issue with crowds, an autoimmune disease, or, sometimes a mental health issue where you're overwhelmed by a lot of crowds and people. As you mentioned, absentee ballot. You can get your absentee ballot as early as 45 days in advance of the election. Again, plenty of time to plan to vote. You could mail it. There are still drop boxes, or you could drop it off at your local election office. We talked about the accessible voting machine, and we talked about curbside voting. I think probably most people know what it is, and it's sort of obvious by what we call it. But again, that gives you the opportunity to vote in person, but from your car. So again, depending on the type of disability you have, that's a really nice accommodation to have. I guess I would say, what more could be done? A lot of it just goes back to better enforcement, right? We have to have better enforcement to ensure that our polling places in Virginia are accessible, to ensure that we have at least one accessible voting machine in your polling place, and that it's working. We need to have better and expanded training for poll workers. I mentioned, many times they don't know that you could bring an assistant in. They don't know that they can serve as an assistant. They don't know how to use the equipment. So that's really critical. And I think we also need to, once again, I go back to allies, but I really think we have to engage more allies. And people have to understand what we call intersectionality, that people with disabilities represent everybody. You could be multiply marginalized. You can be a female who's Black, who has a disability, right? And somebody who's maybe part of the LGBT community. I mean, we are the one marginalized group that's part of every other group. So I think it's really important to understand that, and again, engage these other groups representing other marginalized individuals and make them realize that, you need to be talking about disability, because that's also impacting and affecting your community. I also think we need to do a better job of engaging the media. I think if we can educate the media and elevate this issue so they can help us raise the consciousness of the general public, I think that will help as well. And I guess my last thought on this is we need to be thinking about it as this is not something that affects them, but it affects us. And the reason I say that is disability can hit you at any time because of an illness, right, or an accident. You have an aging parent, or assuming most of us are lucky enough to live a long life, which you see many people, 80s, 90s, even past 100, it's going to impact you, disability, right? It could be loss of hearing, sight, mobility, whatever the issue is, more than likely it will impact you. So knowing that, it behooves all of us to ensure that voting is accessible, to every disabled individual, who wants to vote, and that right is being expanded and preserved. I think that's, if we can do, I think, just half of that, we go a long way in improving the rights of people with disabilities.
I liked how what you said about, anyone can become disabled at any time. It's a non-exclusive minority group, as I like to think about it. If you're lucky, you won't have to experience that. But majority of us are not that lucky in life. So um, it is a very important thing for all of us to keep in mind of just these things matter to you, even if at the moment it doesn't affect you.
It could happen to us, and we should be fighting for those rights.
How can the listeners who are at home right now be advocates for voters with disabilities?
One way to do it is, if you see or think you see something that's not accessible, then say something, right? It's one way to do it. I would say, especially, in this election season, start considering candidates that care about disability issues, that maybe have a disability platform, who understand that disability rights are civil rights. Again, because I know you represent, older Americans, who may or may not have disabilities, but a lot of issues that impact disabled individuals, also impact older Americans. And I think, again, it just goes back to what we were talking about. I think we can't think of this as an issue that either affects somebody else, or, well, I'm not disabled now, or it doesn't impact me, and it doesn't matter. But it does matter, because, like I said, one, it may impact you, and two, I think we have a responsibility as citizens of this country to ensure that people's rights are being protected. And this is, this franchise is one of the most important things we were given, and we should make sure that everybody has the right to it. It's a fundamental right, and everybody has that right. And I guess, just in general, just being more aware and informed and enlightened. Because I do know from my own experience, when disability doesn't touch your life, it isn't something that you're thinking about. And I do think we all need to be, like I said, a little more aware.
Where can people find you guys online? How can they get in contact with you if they want to chat, if they want to see more of your resources?
So we're in the process of developing a website. So we don't have a website yet. We hope to go live by the end of the year. And then maybe when that happens, hopefully we can get back in touch with you, and you can let folks know that we have a website that's up and running. But in the interim, we do have a Gmail address, which is REV UP Virginia spelled out. So it's REV UP and then Virginia spelled out at gmail.com. And you can contact us there. You could also email us and let us know that you'd like to be put on that Gmail list, so that you get our information. And we don't send out a lot, but you'll get timely, I think, and important information from us. And if you'd like to join our monthly coalition meeting, so we meet the first Thursday of every month. So again, you can send an email to that Gmail address and say, we'd like to join the list. And by joining that list, you'll get an invite to the monthly meeting by letting us specifically know that you'd like to get an invite. And then we do have two social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram. So you can follow us both on Facebook and Instagram. So those are the main ways to reach out to us. And again, we would certainly, we want to keep building this tent. So we would certainly welcome anybody, at the very least, joining that Gmail list and, getting our information. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to try to answer it as quickly as possible. Generally, it's just myself and Susan. So we can't always respond in 24 to 48 hours, but we will get back to you. And again, I just want to mention, and maybe you could help us promote this, is we will be having that candidates forum more than likely in September. So we would love to have as many people from the community attend and really, again, show the power of disabled Virginians.
Yes. All of that information will be down in the description of this episode for anyone that's listening at home. If you want to get in contact with Helena or Susan, or just see kind of a little bit more about what REV UP has to offer, what their resources are. So I just want to say thank you for being here, Helena. I really appreciate it. And I know that the people listening at home really appreciate it. This was great.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity as well. I think this is really important. REV UP Virginia is not quite a household name, so hopefully, this will get our message out there and get more people involved and energized. And again, we just really appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you for listening to Aging Revolution, the Java podcast. I'll see you next time.